Okay, well, hi everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Devin Dean. I work with the Central Mountain Small Business Development Center in Salida. Today we are here with Otisa Eads, HR and Systems Strategist Consultant. So for the next hour or so, Otisa will be taking us through part one of communication and feedback styles. We are recording this session, so you can watch it on demand later. If you have any questions, do please feel free to type them into the chat or come off of mute, and we can get those questions answered. But if you do prefer to wait, we will stop the recording at the end, and you can ask your questions at that time. Next slide, please. And just real quick before we get started, the Central Mountain SBDC offers no-cost confidential consulting as well as free or low-cost workshops, such as this one, and assistance with access to capital. Please feel free to reach out if you would like to register for a free consulting session. Next slide. All right, and our center serves Chaffee Lake and Park counties, the three yellow areas in the center, but we are part of a 14 center network. So if you do not live in one of our counties, we are happy to get you in touch with your best local resource. And without further ado, I give you Otisa. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's lunchtime, so I have my smoothie. So you might see me sneak in some sips of my smoothie, to make sure I stay hydrated and have some fuel. So today's workshop is communication feedback. We'll see how far we get with our, I think like an hour and a half. I love this training. I do it often with my clients. It's some folks, they realize that they have either seen this, done this, when it comes to learning more about their communication styles and how it shows up in their lives and in the workplace. So you might hear some things like, oh, yeah, I've heard of this style before. But it goes really in depth in kind of seeing like how this shows up, how these things kind of can play out in the work environment, what to be mindful of, especially if you are a business owner, you're in leadership positions. It's just great to kind of be aware of how you're showing up when it comes to communication, but also your team and your staff. So we're going to go over individual communication styles. We'll talk a little bit about what a group communication style could look like. We'll talk about different types of feedback. In part one, I don't think we'll get to the conflict management styles and how that relates to communication just yet in this session, but definitely the next one that we have later this month. And then also later, we'll talk about collaborative and inclusive culture and how all of this relates together in session two. And in every session, you're going to see this slide. It's just more of when we have group discussion, just these kind of agreements that we will uphold during the time if we have participants that want to share and share their experiences and their ahas during the workshop. So we're going to jump right in. We're going to talk a little bit about a few. There's 5 types of communication styles. We're going to talk about 2 of them on this slide. So we have assertive and we have aggressive. And I put them together because a lot of the times people assume the traits of one as the other. So someone might be, they might have the demeanor of assertive, and yet people might take that as aggressive. So I wanted to put them together so we see the differences between them. I'm not going to read all of the descriptions of each style. You can do that in your own time, but I will read a few of the bullet points. So for assertive communication style, they do not resort to manipulation or pushing limits. Rather, they seek compromise and consensus through active listening and clearly expressing their wants and needs. Assertive communicators tend to have naturally high self esteem, and they do not veer into passive or aggressive communication styles. This style of communication is recommended in most business settings. They practice using I statements, and they also have a calm and measured, positive in many situations, can be handled. They're about problem solving and proactively using their assertive communication to reach those results or those solutions. And so I like talking about assertive because it's also about how they are intentionally listening and communicating their needs and their wants. And I just did a workshop with a client yesterday about mirroring. Mirroring is a technique that folks can use when they're talking with their staff, their team, if they are facilitating a conversation between two staff members that might have some tension or conflict. And also, it's just a great skill to use when you are practicing active listening. So I would say that's another trait of an assertive communicator. Aggressive, I would say, is the pendulum swing on the other side of this. So this communication style can be seen or received as hostile, threatening, and comes from a place of wanting to win at all costs. An aggressive communicator behaves as if their contribution to the conversation is more important than anyone else. And the content of their message is often lost because of the tone of their delivery. This type of communication can result in people feeling belittled, steamrolled, or intimidated. In day-to-day operations, this is not a style that will endear someone to their colleagues, and it is advised that this style is avoided. So I want to give examples, and if you all have examples, you can feel free to share them. But assertive communication, of course, is the ideal. Like, that's the one that folks I suggest practicing using. Aggressive, sometimes things happen. Sometimes folks are not focused on what's happening for the other person in whether it's a conflict, discussion. Some folks, they might get easily agitated or they're charged. And so maybe they come off more aggressive in their communication style. I always tell folks, if you see someone that's like that is displaying aggressive communication style, to check in with them and just say, hey, can we check in? I'm noticing, I'm feeling a little, I'm feeling that you are trying to share something with me, but I'm getting lost. It's getting lost in translation, and your delivery is distracting me from what you're trying to share with me. Can we take a few moments to check in? Take some breaths. Maybe you have to go take a break and come back and we can have this discussion. Just kind of redirecting, checking in and saying, hey, I want to hear you. I want to listen to you, but I'm getting distracted by, how charged you are about what you're trying to express to me. And seeing where the conversation can go from there. I always tell folks too, I come from the catering and hospitality world, and aggressive communication style is actually very common in the kitchen. Literally, there's things that could be on fire. So someone is going to say, hey, watch what you're doing, or someone could get burned, someone can get hurt. So you might see this communication style in that environment, and it's pretty normal. And when I was working in catering, I had to get used to that. And so I used to joke with my team at the time about how, when, and where this communication style is appropriate. And so sometimes in the kitchen it was, sometimes it wasn't. I had to step in and say, hey, that's going too far, chef. Like, let's calm it down. So anything anyone wants to say or share about these two communication styles? If you're watching this on demand, you can kind of write down where have you seen these styles in your life or in the workplace? Have you used these? It's okay, no judgment. We all have our days. If you've displayed aggressive communication style, whether it's at home or in the workplace, what did you learn from this? Or can you reflect back and think what worked well when using assertive and what didn't work well when using aggressive, or vice versa? Have you had some folks receive that differently? So yeah, you can take some time to reflect about those styles if you would like. And then there's passive. And I feel like I love talking about this one because I think that this is very prevalent in the workplace. You have some folks who identify with this communication style. And when I do this training, people are like, oh my gosh, that's me. I do this all the time. And I say to those folks, like, don't, you're not bad. I think that it's just, we think that this is the easiest communication style in a work environment because we don't want to we don't want to upset others. Maybe we're nervous in expressing ourselves and end up be taken the wrong way. So it's okay if I read these descriptions and you feel like it's you. I always joke and say I am a recovering people pleaser, and so I used to be a passive communication style person back in the day. And I'm happy to tell you stories of how that just didn't work out very well. But the passive communication style is another way of describing it as the people pleaser type. This type of communication is self-effacing, conflict avoidant, and easygoing. So this person is going with the flow. They don't want to rock the boat. They try very hard to make sure everyone around them is happy. That's not to say that a passive communicator is always happy. In fact, this style of communication can lead to resentment, building up over time because the person is unable to clearly communicate their opinions, needs, and wants. The passive communicators tend to step back and let others, more assertive or aggressive folks, lead the way or make the decisions. They can find it very difficult to effectively express themselves and want to avoid confrontation at all costs. This can directly lead to their good ideas never being heard or a lot of miscommunications to come up. And so I always tell folks that if you notice someone is always agreeable, they're always going with the flow, they never want to rock the boat, check in with them one-on-one. Say, hey, I noticed that there was an opportunity for you to share something with the group, and I noticed that you didn't. What happened for you there? I think when you notice someone exhibiting passive communication as their style, it's great to check in with them one-on-one. They're probably more apt to share things with you one-on-one as a leader or as a executive director or business owner than they will with the group. And the goal is to get them comfortable in expressing themselves and communicating in real time if they can. This person might be great communicating via email. They might be great with written communication versus in-person communication. Just some observations, not that this is a one size fits all, everyone's different. But as a former people pleaser, I had to work really hard in just saying what I needed to say, expressing that, and always going back and saying, hey, what I meant to say was this, and trying to get comfortable expressing my thoughts and ideas because they needed to come out. And some folks, they may either resonate or they may not, and that's okay. And so I always say that this person needs some one-on-one support, some coaching to get them comfortable with bringing their ideas to the table, getting comfortable with sharing with the group, or just checking in with them, saying, "Hey, I noticed that you were kind of to yourself during this meeting, and I was really excited to hear your thoughts on this new campaign we're doing." Right. So this person needs some confidence, and they need to practice being a little assertive and understanding that yes, it's uncomfortable, but encouraging them along the way to kind of step out of their comfort zone. Any thoughts on this communication style?
Yep, recovering people pleaser. Here. This is yeah, I like this. This is really interesting of how, yeah, just the times that I felt that I could kind of step out of that was having a good leader or someone tell me, like, do exactly what you said, just kind of step away and say, hey, I was really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this, and I noticed you're really quiet. And usually it's, yeah, because I didn't want to say something in front of the whole group, or I wasn't sure if what I was going to say would have been valid. And it's taken a lot of practice, certainly, to find, yeah, what things you feel comfortable being assertive on and the things that you don't. Anyway, yes, this is great.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, and I tell folks it's a coaching, and it's, I think, reminding this person that, like, I tell, sometimes I'll talk to folks and talk messy, like, try not to be perfect in what you're trying to say. I think too, being a former people pleaser, passive communicator, I would focus really hard on having this amazing thing to say and making sure I say everything correctly, when really it's just getting it out and practicing, being uncomfortable, sharing your ideas, and it may not come out perfectly, right? And so I'll say to someone, like, we're just going to talk messy. It's not going to be perfect. We're just going to get it out, and then we'll refine as we go together. So I think this person just needs practice being in that space. You're absolutely correct. And then there's the passive aggressive communication style. This style of communication, like the name suggests, combines both the aggressive and the passive communication styles together. The passive exists on the surface while the aggressive simmers below. On the outside, the communicator seems easygoing, but they are operating from a place of anger and resentment. This bubbles up over time and can be shown through sarcasm, being patronizing, starting rumors, or gossiping. Their frustration comes out through indirect routes, but they will have the same effect as someone who is straightforwardly aggressive. Over time, colleagues will not want to work with them, or folks will be uneasy to work with them on a project directly. This style can be very toxic in the workplace, spreading discontent, resentment throughout the team or department. There are no times that this style of communication is appropriate in a business setting. And before I go into the behavior change, the thing about passive aggressive is usually they haven't really resolved the resentment that they're feeling. They haven't kind of acknowledged that, you know what, I don't feel heard. And they haven't talked to someone about what's really going on, and they've let it kind of sit and bubble, and things kind of pile up over time. And so it's if you recognize it, it's important to address that with the person right away and just say, hey, what's going on? I noticed this, or hey, I saw that you got really upset about this one thing. Like, what's happening for you? What's going on? What's the root of this? Let's figure this out together before it can be harmful to the group. So it's really important if you notice these little things, especially gossiping and rumors, or this person is always, like, did you hear about so and so? Or, they're just wanting to focus on those actions rather than their work, or, so they're a little bit disengaged or they may snap. It's important to kind of figure out quickly, like, what's happening for them, what support do they need, um, and also, listen to what they have to say because clearly they haven't been speaking up. So behavior change. So look at if you are the person that's exhibiting the passive aggressive communication style, look at your motivation when communicating. Are you coming from a place of wanting to help solve the problem, or are you lashing out? Adjust how you approach conversations and try to focus on the positive, solution-oriented statements instead. Pinpoint where the anger is actually coming from. Do you feel like your team doesn't listen to you? Do you feel like your contributions are overlooked? Find out what the issue is. Communicate this with your manager, leadership, um, partner, business partner, whoever it is, as soon as you can. And I always say, have a third party, um, especially when it comes to like sharing. Hey, I've had this on my heart for a long time, and I'm going to share all this stuff with you. This person is not prepared. So I think it's important to have a third party present if you can, to be able to work through that together. I think that would be an idea to consider. Any thoughts on this one before we move on? Okay.
It's tricky.
Yeah, it is tricky.
Yeah.
Any,
Just yeah, I mean, dealing with somebody like that, and especially if they are um I don't know, unwilling to like see anything or to take in any like feedback, and they perceive it all as negative. And I mean, I guess I'm just talking about like an incredibly toxic individual, which like we've all been around, right? Like in different aspects of our life, but in work, it's that type is just, I really, yeah, like want to run the other way because yeah, and they're not fun.
no, and it's also draining, right? Um,
Incredibly, yes.
it's extremely draining for the staff, for the, or the team.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and I think, it's the result of, like you have on there, behavior changes and, I think behavioral issues and like, potentially being just emotionally dysregulated and emotionally immature. And, unfortunately, like, yeah, those people they are out there and sometimes they're your boss and that's so hard.
Yes, and we didn't get to this in this presentation, but I'm going to talk about it because I just talked about mirroring with my team or a client yesterday.
Oh,
Is
right.
Yeah, like practice. I think like yes, you want to run away, and it's more like, okay, who can be the neutral observer, or who can be the third party in this conversation? It's a little bit more challenging when it's a boss, obviously, because of the power dynamic there.
Yep.
Um, but it can't hurt to practice. And then also for me, these are learning opportunities for the next job or role that you're in. And so I think when it comes to the passive aggressive, because I've seen it in other forms where maybe it doesn't go down the toxic road, but this person was upset with their colleague over something that happened like 3 months ago, right? But
Yeah.
they never resolved it. They never talked about that conflict. They never sat down and had a discussion because this person's passive. They do not confront stuff. So
Right. Right.
that's where it's like important, if someone observes, even if it's a colleague that observes this behavior, like, hey, manager, leader, or people involved, I'm noticing this. tension, have y'all talked about it? Have you like talked to the manager about it? And then that's all you can do. If you're the leadership, if you're in leadership or if you're the manager, then that's why it's important to have check-ins with your team, having those one-on-ones, or having some time on the calendar to say, hey, how are things going? So that way this can be a little bit on the radar before it gets bigger than where it needs to be. But it all depends on the work environment and the folks in leadership and the culture, of course. But yeah, I completely resonate with what you're saying, Jennifer.
Yeah. Yeah, and it does. And you're right. I had a situation like that at my previous job, and there was no place to go. It was a small business. He was the owner and my boss, and there was no HR department. So yeah, and I just kept working on, like trying to be positive and boundaries and boundaries and boundaries, and he just kept ignoring them. And it was like, all right, and this is not. And then you have to make a bigger decision of like, okay, don't believe this person is ever going to change. So it's not worth it anymore. You know what I mean? Like I got, and again, like going back to what you said too about the culture, because if like they are the culture, yeah, it's just a difficult one. And I think these communication styles, I think there's a new added like level of I don't know, complexity, which is, that now like through the pandemic and post-pandemic, we're communicating more and more remotely. And I don't have my camera going because I can't get it to work. And I'm new in this role. But anyway, but yeah, I think yeah, those dynamics, communication dynamics are just yeah, absolutely fascinating. So thank you for this training.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit about what you said about the remote environment being
Yeah.
an indicator. Like I think that's why I always like for instance, I joke about being mindful of nonverbal cues. Apparently it's between 85 and 95% of our communication comes from nonverbals. And I forget to put this slide and stat in here.
Oh,
But
yes. Good
yes.
point.
So a lot of the times I tell folks, like I'm a little over dramatic in virtual meetings. So people can see that I'm here, I'm happy, I'm having a good time. Like when I work with my contractors, I'm not smiling, I'm in the zone, I'm working, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, are you okay?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm great. I'm just in the zone, I'm working," right? So I feel like the remote or hybrid work environment does add a layer, like you said, of complexity to communication. And I think I'm someone I'd rather over communicate just to make sure we are on the same page. I also
Hmm.
talk a lot about written versus talking, right? Whether it's on the phone, whether it's via Zoom. And I always tell folks, like, I always recap, even if we had a Zoom call or we had a phone call, I send a recap to make sure we're on the same page of what we discussed because a lot of
Hmm.
things can get lost in translation. Um, and so yeah, this is, I feel like when I do this training, it's like I don't want people walking around trying to like say, oh, you're aggressive or you're passive. It's like, no, 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 focus on yourself, but just kind of notice where you see things and how you receive information, right? Like the aggressive assertive again, like sometimes I'm really excited and I'm passionate, I'm talking about something, and that could be received as someone else being aggressive because they've never seen that before. And then we just talk about it, like, well, no, I was excited. I was passionate. I was pumped up. And it just comes off that way. It's like, oh, okay. Well, noted. Got it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Great point.
Yeah. So then there's the manipulative communication style. And this style of communication uses cunning, deceit, influence to control the outcome of the conversation and thus the actions of people around them. I also call this as dangling the carrot. So I'm not sure if you've ever had a manager in the past or a boss in the past that would always dangle carrots. Like, well, if you do this, I will do this for you. Or if you work really, really hard this week and you put an extra overtime, you're going to get this thing, but the thing never comes.
Yeah.
Or and so I always tell folks to be mindful if you notice someone doing the dangling the carrot. And I think as I work with more clients and doing more leadership training, I do think it is a tactic that used to work in the past. I think that someone thought this was efficient in getting folks to work harder because there's something coming. Nowadays, that is not, to me, this is manipulative, right? It's not a tactic that I think works, but I think there's some folks that they have seen that in the past. Maybe they worked in sales, right? Maybe they had a certain role where this was helpful in motivating them. But I feel like overall, to do this is not supportive of anyone. So I want to just add that, like, I've talked to leaders who do this and they don't even realize that they're doing it. I'm like, you're dangling the carrot. Stop doing that. Like,
Mm,
quit it. Either give them a bonus because they deserve it, but don't sit there and promise things that you because you want them to work harder. Like, that's not cool. That's cringy and yucky. Anyway, these communicators rarely say what they mean. Instead, they will bury their real goals within layers of struggling to get their way without the other person even realizing it. This style is often characterized as insincere and patronizing. And when people realize that they've been played by a manipulator, they will not respond well to that person in the future, especially with communicating. While some manipulation could come in useful in a customer facing role, air quotes, because I don't agree with that, but air quotes, there is a need to calm down an irritated client. So some folks might use that, like I said, sales, right? This style will lead to some clashes within teams and departments if one employee is using this consistently, especially if it's a leadership and staff dynamic. That's where it can clash, and it could also lead to a toxic or hostile work environment if this is a constant thing. Where possible, a manipulative communicator should be steered into assertive communication. So here's where the behavior change comes in. The manipulator knows what they want to achieve and has clear goals. They're just not taking the best path to get there. So by prioritizing everyone's needs, not just their own, they can achieve better results without upsetting their colleagues. So the goal here is to shift this behavior to an assertive communication style instead, and getting them to see this is what you're doing and this is the results you're getting, and that could be negative results, right? People aren't excited to work for them, the motivation or morale's down, whatever. If you want to see more positive results for everyone to benefit from these goals that you have, I would say share the goals that you have with your team. Let them know what's going on for you and what you're dealing with, and seeing how that benefits the team, and then shift to more assertive communication style. And you can do this by, active listening, using I statements, checking in, blah, 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 right? So that's the only thing with this. I feel like the behavior change can happen if caught early and recognized early, and showing them this is what you're doing and this is how it's making either you feel, or this is what's happening with your staff. So I can talk about this one for hours. Any thoughts, ahas on this one?
yeah, those people are real scary. But fortunately, have not had any of those in my business life. Just my ex-husband of 25 years. So yeah, I'm recovering people pleaser too.
Yeah, yes. And I was gonna say too, if someone's passive, it's gonna be challenging if they have a manipulative communicator around. Sometimes they don't even realize that this is the person's like tactic or strategy. But yeah, I tell folks, like, a lot of these styles you might see in your personal life more than you see in your work life, or you notice them more in your personal life, and then you start to recognize them in the work environment. For me, it's in the workplace. It's just important to have these as tools, or to refer to them when you are working with a colleague or you're noticing certain things. You're able to go, okay, maybe this is the communication style that they're using for whatever reason. Let's just talk about it, and use
Hmm.
yourself as an example, right? So I always use myself when I'm facilitating or talking about these. Like, I tend to be an assertive communication style now, but I used to be very passive. And here's how that's played out for me, or hey, I've noticed these things that you're doing. What's happening for you? I'm curious what's going on in your life, or curious in what's going on when we talk about this project, to get them to see like what's going on, right? Instead of saying you are an aggressive communicator, like, let's not accuse.
Right.
Let's see what they are noticing, what they're observing, what's coming up for them, even though you may be able to spot that.
Yes. Great point.
And then I love this. This is my favorite part. This comes to where how some folks kind of give and receive information. So some folks just have a preferred method of communicating outside of the styles, right? So this is how a speaker communicates information to others. And I love doing this with my clients because it's so funny how they're like, oh, this explains our communication breakdowns because you're functional and I'm intuitive. And that's why we have problems with one another when we're talking
Right.
about things. So this is one of my favorites. So we have analytical, intuitive, functional, and personal. An analytical communicator favors numbers, data, stats. They want a quantifiable information, and they tend to disregard emotional statements as too vague or unimportant. When communicating with this type of person, do your research first, lay out the numbers, and then follow up with your request. And I joke that, like, when I do this with a team, there's always someone that's like this. They're usually in HR and operations or accounting, usually, not always. And people are like, oh, this explains things. And then, we talk like, well, it's important to have this person because usually in their role, they need the data, they need the facts, they need the stats, they need to be able to use this information for whatever they're doing in their role and to not see it as they don't care, right? It's just, that's the way they communicate and that's kind of how they receive information and to be able to remember that sometimes. Then you have the intuitive communicator, and they're about the big picture. This person doesn't like to get bogged down into the nitty-gritty details of a project. They prefer the general lay of the land. They are quick to see the broad picture and can easily leap to the conclusion, sometimes offering great insights as to how best to complete a project. Yeah, these are the visionary folks. They see how it's supposed to be done. They don't really want to get into the details of how, but they have the vision, they know where they're headed, they know where they're going. And those folks are also really important on a project. Then you have the functional communicator, and they're on the opposite spectrum of the intuitive. So they love details, they love step by step processes, they love outlining each and every single part until they reach the conclusion, and they have it all tied up in one package. They're very detail oriented, good at understanding which processes will be the most helpful to ensure success, and they can be trusted to create functional timelines and allocate tasks and manage projects. And then lastly, we have the personal. Personal communicator is the opposite to the analytical, of course. They prefer to use emotional language and value the human connection and seeking to know how their colleagues are feeling as well as to what they are thinking. And I joke and I say, you want to have everybody on your team. You want an analytical, you want an intuitive, you want a functional, you want a personal. And if you're really, really wanting to grow or enhance your communication styles, be able to float between all of these. As a business owner, I have to float between all of these. And yeah, I feel like working in HR, I had to really practice the personal because I'd be like, hey, I need this from you, that from you. Did you sign this document? All right, we're done. And they'd be like, you didn't ask me how my day was. And I was like, oh, you're right. I should ask how your day is before I give you a list of demands or requests. So I think it's important to know the distinction between these, especially if you have a team of with folks that communicate differently, but also to be able to adapt to each and every one of these because there's going to be a situation where you need to be a little more analytical. You have a report due, you have to gather evidence and data and research to present. Or you might having a one-on-one with your staff member, and instead of getting right into all this feedback you want to give, maybe check in to see how they're doing that day. How's their day going? How's their week? How was that deadline they had last week that they were stressed about? Maybe start the conversation there. That's why I always say checking in. Have you checked in with that person before getting straight into the weeds? And also, if you find someone who's really detail oriented, instead of getting frustrated, admire the fact that they want to, get to the details of the project and map out the timeline. That's important. And so I've noticed that sometimes when there's a functional person on the team, it like frustrates a few people. Like, oh, they have so many questions and they want to, map out all the steps. I'm like, well, that's important. Just remind them of when you need that or when to do that on their own time or ask them to email you a list of questions to get to. But feel free to figure out how to make that work for the benefit of the team or the organization, right? So
Mhm.
any thoughts on these styles when it comes to communicating information? Okay. All right, we'll keep it going. But yeah, this is my favorite one. Teams love doing this. And then we have team communication here. So I kind of compiled what I think teams should consider when having communication styles together. I also suggest to my clients for them to come together and say, how do we want to communicate as a team? And it can be as, vague as like, we want to have open communication. Like you can be vague if you want, but you can also get to the details of here's what's important to us. We have a certain process for how we communicate things. We prefer in person for XYZ tasks, and we are okay with remote for these things. Like I suggest teams coming together and mapping out how they want to communicate together. Um, that way, it's just you can refer to that when you're like, okay, so we're gonna do, we have remote meetings once a week, and I'm gonna make sure that we use this time to talk about XYZ. We have a specific routine for how we do this, that, and the third. So I just think it's important, to kind of talk that through together if that's available, or if you're a manager, kind of mapping out what you would like and getting feedback from your team on if these communication process works for them, and see what they think. I think that's honestly my best advice. But here's a few examples. Encouraging openness and transparency, allowing two-way feedback, and allocating space for that, especially if it's projects, events. I always tell folks to carve out space for feedback. And if you have a large team and that's kind of difficult to do one-on-one, have a feedback loop system with surveys or questionnaires where you, the manager, can get feedback written, and then you can decide like we should have a one-on-one next quarter or whatever needs to happen. Be sure to respect all opinions and remind folks that you do respect all opinions, especially if you're in a leadership position. Define each role. Make sure folks know where their lane is, especially when it comes to communication, right? Or maybe you have a team meeting and you rotate who's hosting the meeting or who's facilitating that meeting, right? So define kind of what each role is and making sure folks are clear on that. Be sure to prioritize team building. That's why when I create agendas for meetings or when I'm hosting any retreat or even workshops like this, normally I would have a check-in question. It might be an icebreaker, it might be just something random I thought of for the day, because I think it's important to build rapport and have the team building be, part of our time together. Develop a routine. So, like I said, like maybe you have team meetings on Mondays, maybe you have your one-on-ones with your staff on a monthly or quarterly cadence. Whatever the routine is, develop it and share that with your team. Practice empathy and compassion, which is difficult, but it's a skill set that I think is really important when it comes to team communication. And I have a whole workshop all about that we'll probably get to at some point. But practicing empathy will carry you along a way when it comes to communicating with one another. And then finally, lead by example. Folks, they watch you and then they copy you. It's just what we do as humans. We see something, we notice it, we do it. So if you lead by example, if you want to have open and transparent communication, then do it. If you want feedback, practice giving feedback and receiving feedback. Lead by example. So these are some tips for team communication. I always tell folks this is not the end all be all. Your homework is to develop this further. I also talk about creating agreements with your team as well. So this is something that you can totally take back with your staff and do this together, or like I said, put something together and get their feedback and their thoughts. Any questions on team communication tips or any thoughts that come to mind before moving on?
Yeah, I just had a quick thing to add. I've done some like different, you know how you can do like an assessment and it determines like your communication style. Are you going to go into that, or do you know any of those? Because I feel like that can be helpful working with teams.
Yeah, they can. There's a lot of assessments. I think my favorite assessment is going to be the Strength Finders. I think there's a new name for that now. But I love the Strength Finders assessment. That's one of my favorites. Um, and then for me, it's really what I say is self-awareness. So spending time learning more about yourself. There's tons of assessments. There's Myers-Briggs, there's Colby, there's DISC, there's all these assessments, and they're great. But spending time and getting to know yourself, whether that's through assessments or reflection, prompts. There's different books so you can learn more about yourself. But I think assessments are a great starting point. But I also think that folks just need to spend time and really become more self-aware of how they're showing up in the world, especially with communication. So even if it's like talking to your partner or your friends and noticing things like I have friends that happen to do the same work. So they're good at calling me in on certain things like, hey, you kind of cut me off there. I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. I was excited. Right. And noticing that you do that and then being mindful when you do that, especially in the workplace. Like, you know what? I did not mean to cut you off. What were you saying beforehand? I was excited or whatever. Like, I think, with all of the training I do, I think self-awareness is the top one. So if that's through assessments, amazing. If that's through books, read the books. But I think sometimes we focus so much on outside things that we don't spend time just going within and saying, hey, how like I do prompts a lot with my clients. So when we get to conflict, I'll give them a list of questions for them to add to reflect on in their individual time. So like how has communication like what did communication look like growing up? Were folks like cutting each other off? Like what was your experience back when you were a kid? How did that change over time? Were you passive in your communication when you were in college? How did you talk to your professors when you had a question, or did you keep it to yourself? Like how has communication kind of shown up throughout your life? And what are your thoughts on that? What do you want to change? How do you want to grow? And I think sometimes we forget that a lot of the answers are in here, but there's amazing tools and resources that can help us get there too. So
Mhm.
hope I answered your question. Sorry.
Yes. Yeah, that was great. Thanks.
Wonderful. How are we doing on time? We're doing okay on time?
Mhm.
Okay. I get excited. And so here's some reflection questions on this section. So which communication style do you identify with? And if you are a team, as a team, which communication style would you want to adapt? And usually people will say assertive, right? But just take some time and kind of map this out, reflect on it. Another question is, where have you seen these play out in your work life or in your personal life? How did that work out for you? What comes up for you when you think about those moments? So yeah, some reflection questions to ponder on. All right, we checked on time, so I'm going to keep going here. And then we get to feedback. We have constructive feedback, which is where we're going to stay in this lane. So, constructive feedback is the type of feedback aimed at achieving a positive outcome by providing someone with comments, advice, or suggestions that are useful for their work or for their future, right? This feedback can be given in different forms. And here we have praise and criticism, and they can play a big role in constructive feedback. The good constructive feedback should focus on the work rather than being a personal negative attack against an individual. Um, when it comes to feedback, I think what's not on here that should be on here is the methods of feedback. So written, verbal, are you doing this in front of a group? Is it a group setting? Like what's the method? What's the environment for the feedback to take place? And I think a lot of folks just forget this. And I also share that when you are asking for feedback, let's say you're a manager and you're trying to gather feedback, it puts the employee in an odd position because they don't know if this is gonna, if they do share honestly, if this could impact them in the future. So kind of being mindful of what's the intention behind receiving and giving the feedback that I'm about to share or receive. Are you wanting to grow in a certain area? Are you wanting to improve something? Are you trying to map out your professional development? And so you want to get feedback so you can figure out what courses to take or what books to read. Like, what is the intention and motivation for giving and receiving that feedback? I think starting there. If you are wanting to receive feedback so you can improve something, be sure you share that, especially if you're in a management leadership role. Offering them different ways to give that feedback. So like I said, questionnaires and written is sometimes easier for someone. I always joke about the microwave crock pot, and you might hear this in future trainings. But you have some folks who are microwave. You ask them a question, they pop out an answer. You have folks like me who like to simmer and marinate and like think about it and process and then give a response. So being mindful of all of those things when asking and receiving feedback. That's why I like written. I'm someone that you ask me for feedback, I'm going to write it to you. And if you want to have a follow-up phone call or a meeting, great, but it's written and I can refer back to it and I can elaborate where needed. That's just how my brain works. And others are different. They might want to have a sit-down coffee and share with you for 15 minutes about whatever you're asking. So okay, I'll stop that rant. So there's praise and criticism. And there's different ones here under each category. So I'm not going to read every single one of them, but praise is where you show appreciation to your employees for the work that you've done. Additionally, you can use praise as part of a larger feedback session by highlighting the things an employee does well, um, and your message carries extra weight. I also tell folks, again, with the written, sometimes writing out, like, I really appreciated that you did this, Jennifer, on this day. You really helped the team to move forward. Oh my gosh. Like I think if some folks would do that, you'll be surprised how important that is to receive that kind of message. I always tell my team how grateful I am for them. So I will send them a voice message telling them, "Hey, I really appreciated you that you did this, 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 this. You made my job easier, and I just want to tell you how grateful I am for you and what you did." It goes a long way. I think also with feedback, we tend to focus on the negative, the bad things, the things they need to improve upon. And so I try to tell folks, if you want to make feedback part of your culture, it's got to be consistent. But also, it's okay to do positive stuff. It's okay to tell someone how, they submitted that report on time and I was able, and that was, and you were able to do the next thing. And that was so awesome that they were able to get that in and they worked late for that deadline to be met. Those things go a long way. They really do. So I try to remind folks like, yes, feedback is about growth and improvement and yada, yada, yada. But it's also important to remind folks of the great things that they're doing for you. And when I used to be an HR manager, I would want folks to compile, like for their performance reviews, to compile all the praises, all the emails from a client saying that they're happy, or the manager that shared some things that you were doing well. And like, it's great to look at all of that too, not just all the things that you need to improve upon that you're lacking. There's also this method I call the sandwich, which I'm sure some of y'all have heard. Sprinkle some praise, do some criticism, end with praise. If you are giving feedback or if you're having a moment where you're giving feedback to an employee or staff member, it's just easier for the brain to receive feedback in that way than negative, 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 positive, or
Mm-hmm.
criticism, 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 positive. They're just going to focus all on that criticism. They're not going to focus on the things that they're doing well in. And to me, it's like a conversation. Like you don't call a parent and just ask them for all the things you need from them and end the conversation. Like you don't do that. How are you? How was your appointment yesterday? Hey, I need this thing from you. Thanks for listening. Talk to you tomorrow. Like it's to me the same thing as having a conversation as giving feedback. So for criticism, it's harder to navigate if it's handled poorly, and it could lead to an uncomfortable situation, working environment, or working relationship. It does play a big role in helping people avoid negative behaviors, or it helps them on their path to growth in their role. It also helps for them to look at their professional development if they have goals that they have set that they want to reach. It's great to give them that feedback on the things they need to improve upon, especially so they can learn from their mistakes or errors. And then finally, when giving any feedback, especially if it's a criticism, regulate your emotions and don't let them get to the best of you. So you can't really give feedback or criticism if you want to be received well if you're coming from an angry, disappointed, or frustrated place. The delivery is going to kind of muddy the message that's being received. So just being mindful of how you're coming in. When we get to the conflict presentation later, I'll talk about a tool, a framework, whatever you want to call it, on how to do this if you're giving some significant feedback that's not positive, and how to do that and work through that where both parties can leave and go, okay, I know what I need to work on. I know how I can support this person. We have a path. So we'll talk about that at the next presentation later. Any thoughts on the different types of feedback? I can keep going, but I want to make sure I give some time for thoughts or questions.
No, you're good.
Okay. And then, of course, knowing me, there's journaling prompts. Get used to it. So, how do you want to receive feedback in the workplace? You can even elaborate further on what does a good feedback cycle look like for you? What does consistent feedback look like for you? What would you want from receiving feedback in the future? Is there a sense of urgency for you to give or receive feedback? If so, why? And what I mean by that is sometimes, like I said, it's that microwave crockpot thing. Some folks, they want to share something right away. They want to tell someone, hey, you messed up on this thing. Cool. Again, kind of take a break, pause, and decide, okay, is this the time and place for that? Is this an email? Is this a conversation? What's the best method? And so this prompt is to kind of slow you down, right? Because the person has to be prepared for the conversation too. So yeah, is there a sense of urgency? If so, why? Where can you practice pausing, gathering your thoughts, and checking in with yourself before engaging in a conversation regarding feedback? And that's for both parties. And again, are you a microwave? Are you a crockpot? You need more time to process your thoughts, or can you share your thoughts readily? And how can you use this analysis to figure out better ways to receive and give feedback? So those are the prompts for that. I think we're at a good stopping point before we get into some other parts um, of this presentation. We have a part two coming up later in February. But I didn't know if there were any other thoughts or questions or any insights or ahas folks want to share with the time we have left.
This has been really great. Thank you, Otisa.
Mm-hmm.
This is just so informative. It's a lot to just kind of sit with as well. You kind of gotta think on it for a while, and these conversations come up daily, and so now it's just kind of that matter of like taking a second when before you react to think just a little bit. So you aren't necessarily reacting in a conversation, so it's a little more intentional.
Yes.
Yeah, I've had to, um, I've had to work quite a bit on that. So it's hard, but like you said, like having self-awareness and awareness for others too, which I just feel like more and more our society is really losing. And so I think we're just like, especially younger generations, like so geared toward like, like being completely self-absorbed, or I don't know, like levels of narcissism, I guess. But yeah, just knowing and even knowing how to, like you said, when we get into the conflict resolution and just yeah, it's I'm kind of reactive and I can be emotional, so I have had to work really hard at like, okay, like I can't be reactive. I have to like wait, kind of let it simmer, marinate a little bit, and then formulate like a well thought out response, like and removing emotion from that, you know?
Yeah, and I think too, I like that you said the awareness to others piece because I mentioned empathy. I think you're absolutely right. I think some folks tend to focus a little too much on themselves and not really remembering this is a two-way conversation or it could be a group, right? And what's happening for everyone else. And I think to me, I mean, I could boil this training down to asking great questions and checking in. Like I feel like that's what I've noticed that folks really don't do. They just jump in with, I have a solution to the problem, we're moving on, and not really stopping and saying, before we get into what I have to say, like, how is this all landing for you? What's coming up for you? Or like, especially when it comes to like not fun things like performance improvement plans, right? PIPs or disciplinary conversations. It's nerve-wracking for everybody involved. And I think that we kind of forget that. And sometimes saying, hey, I know this is an uncomfortable conversation. How are you feeling right now? How are you coming into this conversation? And just and then going into the stuff, right? Like, so I think you're absolutely correct. I think that we need to sometimes slow down. Remember the why too. I say that a lot with all my clients and all my workshops. Like, remember the purpose, especially in a workplace. I think, like I always tell folks, like, having friends and having rapport is a bonus to a job. That is a bonus. You are lucky, and it's awesome when you can work with people that you enjoy being around, you want to have coffee with outside of work. Like, that is a bonus, but it's not a requirement.
Right.
And if it is, like, good luck. But it's not always a requirement. So I tell folks that in the workplace is the same thing as navigating relationships anywhere you go. And so I think that if folks just slow down a little bit and remember the why, like, why are we here? We are working at this company to do XYZ. I work with a lot of nonprofits, so I have to remind them, why are we here? What is the mission of this
Hmm.
organization? Okay, our mission is to end homelessness. Awesome. So let's not let this little tiff on how I emailed you about a project get in the way of the mission, but let's fix it. Let's change the behavior. Let's make it easier for us to communicate. But let's not get away from the why and the mission of why the heck we're here and why I work here. Right. So that's kind of how I look at all of that, is it just boiling it down to the root and figuring out and remembering that when we're having conflict, it's going to come up. Like I tell folks all the time, like, we can't run away from conflict or miscommunication, but we can change. We can shift gears. We can redirect. And yeah, so I agree with everything that you said about, the being aware of others. And again, remembering the why. Why in the heck are we doing this? So
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah. Great
Well,
stuff. Thank you.
you're very welcome. I know we're ending early, but I didn't want to spill into part two. So I hope that was okay for you all, everyone that's watching on demand. Get your pencil and get your journal or your phone and write out your answers to those prompts. Bonus points if you bring them next time and you want to share them. Or if you want to email and just share them with someone for accountability, feel free to do so. I'm gonna just share information about myself because I always forget to do this. So bear with me as I get to that slide. Pretend you didn't see any of that. Okay, so this is my email address, my website. You can also scan the QR code if you want to follow me on social media or just see what I got going on. And you want to stay in touch, feel free to scan the QR code here or email me. I'd love to stay in touch with you and learn more about you and see how this is resonating for you. So thanks for having me, you all, and I'll see you in later in February.
Yeah, thank you, Otissa. I'm
Thank
going to go
you.
ahead and stop the recording here